Sydney. In closing government, the team from Victoria Wellington University. And in closing opposition, the team from Durham. All the rules are as they were before. You'll hear this sound at 6, this at 7, and this at 7:15. Anyone got any questions before we get started? Queries? Alright, great. That said, I'd like to call on the Prime Minister to open up the case that stands in her name.
Ladies and gentlemen, we recognise that there is something seriously wrong in the international system, where just for enough money you can buy Monitor Consultancy Group, as Gaddafi did, to come into your country and revamp your PR image and sustain your power as a dictator, entrench that within your polity and stop criticism within the international community for longer than these dictators otherwise would be able to without that Western assistance. We say the people who take part in this are morally abhorrent, and Steph and I today are going to tell you first of all why they have a duty to stop such aid, and second of all why this does speed change within these sorts of dictatorships. Now, firstly, however, let's a brief framework for the debate. And the first thing we say is that any companies and strategy consultants which come from liberal democracy have a duty when they're approached by dictatorships, which we define as states where there are no votes, or at the very least fraudulent voting systems, and active abuses of power. We think perhaps to use things such as Freedom House's index in order to assess exactly what constitutes dictatorships in this instance. They should accept those contracts, but they should actively sabotage the implementation and advice they give to those dictators thereafter. And we set out all sorts of things. So we're thinking of firms who sort of do things like PR services, military tacticians, and strategy consultants. The one exception we say is when dictators have given a stated aim that they are aiming to implement a transition to democracy. Then we think it's fine. And obviously we say this is going to be a secret policy, ladies and gentlemen. We obviously don't. Okay, so yeah.
Okay, does this include people like Harish going to work for the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund?
Like, we don't think. Yeah, okay, yeah. We think if you can prove in those cases there is an active propping up of the regime, then that fits entirely within proposition's logic, and then yes. If we don't think it does in practice, then no. Okay, so that's our case, that's the framework today. Let's get first of all on then, ladies and gentlemen, to why exactly it is these people have a moral duty to not just not engage with these, well, to obviously engage with these regimes, but to actually undermine them. Let's be very clear. First of all, the people who do this are active participants in the systemic violence which dictatorships are all out against their people. And they are for several reasons. First of all, in many cases, the kinds of services which they are offering are directly detrimental to those populations. So, for instance, we'd point to private military firms who are often hired to put down riots, which might otherwise actually create groundswell against governments. Or, for instance, they might crush other rebel territories within the group. So, we said, for instance, executive outcomes throughout the 1990s go into Angola to be able to crush UNITA and the MPLA at different times. That fundamentally was a harm to different citizens within their polity that those governments would not otherwise have access to, given the fact that they were not reliant upon popular will within their countries. Second of all, we say any kind of work, even when it's not direct military, props up these governments by proxy. So, for instance, were they to offer PR services, what they enable that dictator to do is within the international community make themselves look more amenable to Western partnerships, or the very least different kinds of partnerships which enable them to channel resources in. So the kinds of work which these Western consultants do will enable these dictators to make it look like their strategic interests are aligned with other nations, and therefore they get those sorts of support within international organisations on the margins, right, which enables them to say, get that access to trade deals or weapons deals coming into their state. And we say these things are all pernicious and help that regime be propped up longer than it otherwise would be. And let's be clear, they only do this because of a profit motive. And we say that is never okay, the money should be able to outweigh those kinds of abuses we should do to other human beings. And we recognise that because within the West, their own countries where these people come from, and they enjoy the rule of law and safety and freedom, which they're helping to undermine in other countries, they would not be able to say sign hitman contracts, because we recognise that your duty to humanity, your common humanity with other citizens, is fundamental. And any individual contract you might want to opt into comes after that and cannot cannot trump that. So it means you can't undertake within the West certain contracts which will be harming other people precisely like hitman contracts.
Yeah.
And so we think this is an individual duty which exists in virtue of humanity, and it's all encompassed and can't be overridden just because a different government in a different jurisdiction with different laws wants you to, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover, they have an active duty to sabotage because they are uniquely placed to do so. We say in the status quo we see many actors internationally maybe trying to undermine these regimes. Sometimes they don't even do that. But we say it's most important when you do have that unique and privileged access which these companies do to be able to go to the core of these regimes, to implement, to put seeds of destruction at that core. And we think that that is something which creates long-term change, as I'm going to tell you in my second point. We think in virtue of that access, that's where you have a specific duty to do it in these cases.
Okay, is it proposition stance that the highest moral goal of any individual is to get the vote for other people?
Not the vote for other people, let's be clear. We're not just talking about the vote, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking about being able to walk down the street in safety often. Like, let's not just say, oh, democracy is just a pure vote. It's about the kinds of accesses of goods you would be able to access it as a citizen. And we think there's only the highest goal, which think that when you're participating in the kinds of regimes and you know systematically deny people, yes, the vote is access to public goods, access to safety, to clean water in many cases, precisely because their governments aren't accountable. This is a massive harm to other people's ability to live their lives in meaningful ways. And yes, when you are put in a position where you can either aid that process of change, or you can stand back and help entrench the kinds of powers which are ensuring that people never have access to those freedoms, then in that particular circumstance, when you are posed with that question, which is exactly what these contracts are, of course you should act against these military, these dictatorships. So then let's just take a look exactly how this does begin to change things. Because we think that even if it didn't change things, you as a contractor have that duty to implement it. But we think there's an additional benefit on our side of the house, and it does actually have practical change in the long run. And that's because, first of all, when we look at the sorts of PR soft power effects these contractors give people and enable them to keep the international community on side for much longer than they would otherwise be because of the kinds of systemic violences which are being perpetrated against their people on the ground. These are the sorts of things, when these PR companies come in, they do indeed, as I mentioned earlier, enable different states to see their interests strategically aligned. So for instance, you see with Kabila in the Congo, like the kinds of cases which get made to the international community are, well, if we prop him up, we'll get access to cobalt and different minerals within his territory. And it's those sorts of cases which they make, which make other nations within international organisations continually support them until there is an overwhelming groundswell within NGO and civil society communities. And sometimes it never comes because ultimately there is only a specific number of issues which can ever be on the table. So that's problematic. And we say, moreover, what you do is when you stop giving them this kind of soft power, you reduce the amount of lobbying within the international community that is done by elites, which hurts these regimes in the long run. But second of all, you actually, on the ground, reduce the kinds of resources which these regimes have access to. You do just get worse kinds of military equipment, right? I mean, it's the difference between regimes being able to organise helicopters to come in and gun down crowds and poor AK-7 or AK-47 rifles which are much more easy to be combated on the ground, right? We think in either case, it's never going to be nice for somebody stuck within these regimes. We say you get a comparatively better world on our side. Ladies and gentlemen, we propose.
Thank the Speaker very much for her comments. Now we cross and ask the Leader of the Opposition to begin the case for Sydney.
Mr. Speaker, we think that when we had American consultants helping lead to the downfall of the Shah of Iran, that it didn't necessarily lead to a better government for the Iranian people, and it didn't necessarily lead to a better government for the region or even for the world. We don't think that there is a moral obligation to lead to the downfall of tyrannical regimes in general, but moreover, we don't think that it is a better circumstance morally for these regimes to be in the absence of consultants' advice. Those are the two questions that I'm going to deal with in this speech, integrating the claims that Jen made as well. So firstly, why there isn't an obligation on these consultants to remove people from even a tyrannical government? And secondly, what type of support these consultants are providing and why it is not, in fact, as morally egregious as the government bench wanted to have you believe in this debate. So firstly, on the obligation of consultants. The first observation that I want to make on this argument is that it wasn't really about the provision of food and the provision of aid that Jen wanted to have you believe, because she was fine for democratic governments to have consultants telling, being able to explain to their people how they were going to prioritise aid or water in the circumstance that they were not able to. So we don't think that there was a clear distinction made by Jen when you were allowing this to be made by democratic governments. For instance, we think that what is the difference between having a democratic mandate when it still means that people are going to be led into misery? For instance, democratic governments hiring consultants when it means that people will be put off welfare, or defence procurement within democratic states. We don't think that distinction was ever actually drawn by Jen, and it wasn't good enough for her to simply say that you shouldn't be able to sign a contract with someone that would remove fundamental rights. Because we think, for instance, democratic governments, when they engage in defence contractors, sign contracts that lead to the death of other people. We don't think that distinction was sufficiently made at opening government. So the first observation that we're going to make is that this is not just an obligation to remove people from under tyranny or the reduction of rights, and there must be something about dictatorships that must be proven to be especially different in this case. But moreover, we don't think, and this is why we don't think dictatorships are different, we don't think you have the responsibility to determine the politics of other countries. Just like countries often give aid to dictatorships. Why do they do that? It's for two reasons. Even though we know that dictatorships often siphon off foreign aid, we still give aid to those dictatorships. Why? Firstly, because we think that some portion of that aid is going to get to the population. Or secondly, we may just do it in our own self-interest, which means that the developed world gets some benefit from giving that aid as well. We think that to the same extent that we believe that some of this advice and some of the efficiency that is gained by having consultants, and I'm going to talk about this more in my second argument, does get to the people, but moreover, that it is absolutely fine for those corporations to act in their own self-interest and to ensure that those states are propped up. We don't agree with constructing a moral obligation that you have to draw people out of a suboptimal political situation, because the one thing that Jen was never able to prove to you is that the political situation that would be left when this regime was sabotaged would be better. So we think the obligation that they have to prove is to an obligation to withdraw people from an unfortunate political situation never actually meant that they have an obligation to make that situation better for those people, because we certainly don't believe that that would necessarily be the case. Which brings me to this second issue about what type of support they're actually providing and whether or not it is morally egregious. We're going to divide this into two things. The first part is probably easier for our bench to prove. That is when these consultants provide economic or social advice to those regimes. We think that what these consultants are actually doing is making that state more efficient, making that state more productive, because those dictatorships, to some extent, to an extent that was never acknowledged by Jen, have an incentive to ensure that their state is to some extent productive, that their people are to some extent happy, and consultants often engage in that. For instance, we saw Mubarak engaging in consultants right before the Arab Spring in order to make his workforce more productive, in order to make his economy grow more. We think that that is a benefit to the people that these consultants are able to bring, in the same way that the Gulf states, for instance, bring in consultants to deal with how they would economically consolidate in the post-oil phase. Like dealing with economic stability and efficiency is a benefit that accrues to those people and is an important aspect of that consultancy. I'll take you now.
As Western citizens, do you think it was morally appropriate for IBM to design the punch card system to help the Nazis draw out millions of Jews?
No, but I also don't think that it is necessarily the case that that would not be something that falls under, for instance, international law. But moreover, I don't think that that necessarily proves that they should have actively sabotaged the Nazis either, which is actually the burden of your case. It's not just not to engage in it, but to actively sabotage them. Because the second point I'm going to tell you is on the strategic and military advice. The reason why we don't think you should actively sabotage these regimes is because you cannot necessarily assure that it would lead to a better political environment for two reasons. Firstly, we don't think that these groups, just in the abstract, when they are ensuring that they are sabotaging these regimes, have any ability to judge whether or not there is going to be a better power to take place within that power vacuum. We've seen, for instance, within all of the Arab Spring elections, that it is not necessarily the case that a less violent regime is going to be taking place within that power vacuum. But secondly, this moral obligation would only exist to the extent that that consultancy was employed destroyed within that jurisdiction. We don't think that when you have been involved with the successor regime, that the next regime is ever going to hire you. So that means that this obligation only extends to the extent that that regime collapses, and that obligation has no incentive to deal, even just hypothetically in their minds, with the existence of the next state or the next regime that would come. So for those two reasons, we don't think that you have an obligation to destroy a questionable political government, because you have no ability to assure that that obligation will be successfully discharged. And that's exactly why Jen was wrong to say that it is a problem for these people to put down rebels, because it is not always the case that those rebels are going to lead to democracy or a better political government as they want you to have believed. The second thing that we want to say is why this isn't a actual moral obligation is because we think that when you lead to suspicion about being sabotage, that it leads to those countries shutting out Western influences altogether. Jen wanted to tell you that this would be a secret model. We think that when you're either offering advice that is actively not what your dictatorship is asking, or offering advice and failing, or in fact implementing the opposite, that it's going to be pretty hard to not see that these people are sabotaging your regimes. And interestingly, in their model, they were able to say you could get consultancies from dictatorships. We think that what that's going to lead is just these consultancies moving to less liberally minded countries, because if they only want to deal with liberally minded consultants in this debate, we think that's a problem, because you're going to lead to the displacement of private military consultants to other dictatorships. We don't think that people have an obligation to remove people from a suboptimal political situation, but moreover, they were never able to prove that that moral obligation was in any way useful and would lead to a better political situation. For that reason, we oppose.
Senator Speaker very much. Now we cross back and ask the Deputy Prime Minister Steph to close out the case for Oxford.
Note that in the entirety of Elle's speech, she never challenges the idea that we have a common obligation to a shared understanding of humanity. She never challenges the idea that we have moral obligations to other people by dint of the fact that they are people. What she says instead is that, she doesn't think that we're necessarily the most effective at it. But I don't think that the justifications that she gives are sufficient enough to carry the round. So note that she's already conceded the first point, which is that you are already above and beyond the contractual obligations that you might have to fulfill a contract when you start doing things like leading to the abuse of other citizens. That obviously goes directly against an understanding of morality. What we want to tell you then is the ways in which actively sabotaging these dictators is the best way to get to advancement of rights for these people in these countries. So the first thing that they give us is an example that involves keywords like the US, Iran, and Shah. What it doesn't involve are other important keywords like CIA and US military, which I would argue are not in fact consultants, but perhaps a government, which is a fundamentally different thing because they have different obligations, right? We're talking about the obligations of individuals as people, that is to say business people, not about the CIA and the military. They have their own obligations to their own citizens for various reasons, and that's an entirely different debate round. The next thing we want to talk about is they say, well, democratic governments aren't necessarily better, and she challenges us to provide why. Well, we have a few different reasons. First off, because if your government is democratic, then presumably you can change it if you don't like what's going on. That's the entire point of it being democratic. Secondly, if you don't have any food on either side of the House, would you like to have no food and no vote, or no food and a vote? We think one of those is better than the other as a result of the fact that you can presumably bring in people who will give you food, as opposed to, for instance, continuing under Robert Mugabe, who clearly has no intention of doing any such thing. The fact that Zimbabwe is not currently starving is in fact a stroke of luck, rather than anything that the ZANU-PF decided they wanted to create. The next thing we tell you is that the reason this is different is because of the totalizing control of dictatorships. So she says, well, there's no reason to prefer some governments over others. We can say, no. Dictatorships are indeed totalizing in the ways in which they're able to control other people's lives. They limit your political freedom, they limit your physical freedom, they limit all kinds of different rights in the ways in which you move throughout society. The reason we think it's important to give some possibility of change to other systems is, well, I guess you might get replaced with another dictator, but presumably that's just, another dictator, which means you're roughly where you started. If you get replaced by somebody that's more useful, or say a less radical dictator, which I'll take you in a moment, we do think is likely because of the fact that being an evil dictator is what got the first guy out of office in the first place, we see a progression and a trend towards progress. Sure.
If you can't ensure that the following dictator will be more effective or less radical, why would you deny the population the ability to have these consultants improve the productivity and efficiency of that state in the meantime?
Because what we would argue is that further entrenches that dictator is in place, right? Which means that when you're going ahead and propping up Mugabe's power by saying like, oh look, now you have some scraps of bread to eat, isn't that great, guys? That's actually just not that much progress to begin with. We actually do think that, for instance, a switch to Morgan Tsvangirai would actually be a much better system for Zimbabwe, and we see those sorts of things as being the more likely outcome than they're just going to get replaced with another dictator. And if that ends up being the solution, we say undermine him too, right? We're doing this in secret, so it's not as though we're saying, look, we actively undermined the other guy, but hire us now, right? No, thank you. We actually are saying, we're trying to do this subtly. So in the event that you pull it off, and it is subtle, well then, gee, you've undermined a dictator and you have a crack at another one. In the event that it isn't subtle and it comes out, well then you've still undermined a dictator, which we consider to be progress. So they say ultimately that we have to prove that things are better. What we think we have done is prove that this is actually going to create change, which they can't create on their side of the house. We think that it means it's a question of things being violent versus not violent, right? If we get a regime to the point where it's revealed as an entire farce, and that the entirety of its image is something that has just been propped up by a few professors from Harvard Business School, that makes it relatively easy to transition into something new and different, as opposed to having to have a prolonged or violent civil war in order to get there. Then the final thing we want to say is that the global trend is towards democracy, because if you look at places that are in transition right now, they get all kinds of international assistance, particularly from institutions that are attempting to set up democratic processes within those nations. We think that's important. So the second thing to talk about, no thanks, is long-term change. And so what we want to talk about there is the ways, and I think I've covered a lot of this, which is that you're going about this in a sneaky way, right? It's sabotage. You don't wear like a sign on your back that says, oh, I am sabotaging you, and as a result, like, give yourself away. We think you do it in the most pernicious way possible, that is to say, subtly. And we think that if you're a clever enough consultant to have gotten yourself hired in the first place, then presumably the people trust you. Why would the dictator have hired you if he thought that you were going to sabotage him? That's a pretty obvious answer.
If I may.
Sure, if you have an answer.
Yeah, okay. Isn't the net effect that when one person is found out, these kind of dictatorships are going to stop hiring Western consultants?
Great, so now they have less talent to prop up their dictatorships. That's our point. So the next thing we want to talk about is the ways in which if they don't keep hiring you, then presumably they are indeed less strong. So the argument we get from Elle here is that, we still do provide economic and humanitarian aid to all of these places, even though it makes the citizens happier than they would otherwise be. We say, sure, if we know that it's going directly to the citizens and is in no way propping up that dictatorship, like, fair enough, but that's like economic aid and humanitarian aid, that is to say, like food, medicine, etc. That's not the same thing as consulting to help a dictator. We think they're entirely different categories. The next thing, though, that we want to say is that they didn't deal at all with our points about elite lobbies that are now actively going for these dictators within the international arena, and the ways in which that, too, leads to the prolonged influence of their power over their own people. That's why you have Mugabe why you had Gaddafi's son making all kinds of friends within Washington, D.C., is because of the fact that nobody was really paying attention to how bad the Gaddafi regime was, because Saif was just so darn charming, right? And the reason he was so darn charming is because he had a number of PR consultants to make him so, and not reveal for the fact that he was indeed the son of a dictator who wished to become a dictator, which we also think is problematic. So then they say, well, look, you're just going to end up displacing private military consultants with other dictators. We think that if you're a dictator who has sufficient military firepower that you've already overwhelmed your entire people, A, you probably don't exist in the globe right now. They can't give you a single example of that. But B, you also probably aren't going to spread that around to other places where you're going to end up more likely you're going to try and destabilize other regimes, which is exactly what you see going on within various places in Africa. So finally, let's talk about why sabotage, although I think I've given you the vast majority of these reasons. They say that we can ensure a much better political environment. We think that the trends are on our side in this regard. We don't see many dictatorships getting replaced with more dictatorships this day and age, for all of the reasons we've already given you. Secondly, we think we at least actually create a potential for change, which they absolutely never do on their side of the house. Finally, they say, well, you can only go so far with the sabotage. I've already dealt with that. So what do you have at the end of the day? We say that you have a moral duty to sabotage dictators because you have a moral duty to the rest of humanity. And that moral duty does not get subdued because it happens to be underneath a different contract. That moral duty is not erased just because you aren't certain you can do anything better than the status quo. If you have a possibility of ensuring that another human being isn't violently attacked on the streets in their own country, you're obliged. We propose.
Thank you very much for your comments. Now we cross back and ask Daniel to close out the case for opening opposition to the city. wet the back of the pages.
Mr. Speaker, we don't believe you have a moral obligation to go Rambo because you're a PR consultant for a regime and make your decisions about how best you think the transition for that country will occur. First of all, because wishy-washy rhetoric about some personal human connection that we all share doesn't actually yield any specific obligations. But second of all, because you expose yourself to personal risk. And third of all, because we believe you might end up damaging that state in the process. We don't believe these are the individuals to whom democracy is the obligation or responsibility. I'm going to deal with some refutation first before exploring more about how we best transition in these particular countries. First of all, about the idea of moral obligations. What we told you in Elle's speech is that insofar as work is legal, i.e. you are not committing war crimes, we do not believe people have obligations above and beyond that to constantly maximise the utility of others or avoid human misery in the employment that they undertake.
Daniel.
And we think that's also true inside the democratic regimes that could be, for instance, hiring PR consultants to conceal massive policy failures or gaining military procurement, which maybe not like taking on a hit contract, but is definitely going to lead to someone to die or the creation of human misery. That is incredibly problematic. And we don't think necessarily just because that government is democracy, because in fact obscuring the democratic character of that government by engaging in PR regimes is still pretty bad, and we don't think they respond to that on this side. What they then said was that the example about the Shah didn't make sense, which forgot the fact that lots of American banks were giving the Shah advice about how to manage his state. But even if it was just the state and the CIA, we didn't understand why just distinguishing between states and individuals meant that they didn't share some obligations. Because if it's true that all human beings have this shared obligation, then the human beings that occupy that government presumably also express that obligation. The self-interest you feel in protecting yourself by earning money or your family is no different from a state's interest towards its own citizens. And apparently that also would coexist with this obligation to help all of humanity. We didn't think, Steph didn't show us a reason why states have this obligation. And we don't necessarily think they have that obligation either. But insofar as if we did have to choose between individuals or states, we would definitely choose states that are less exposed to personal risk. We believe these individuals going in attempting to sabotage these regimes, which are often violent and brutal, means that they're exposing themselves to a high level of personal risk. And insofar as it might be good for people to have democracy, and you might share that belief yourself even while hypocritically working for these governments, we still don't believe you personally have to expose yourself to the practice of espionage as a civilian in order to bring that regime down. Closing.
If we shouldn't prevent people from maximising their rational self-interest short of the commission of war crimes, would you enable companies to sell weapons to dictatorial regimes?
Yes, we would enable them to sell weapons to dictatorial regimes, because we believe that sometimes the people they use those weapons against are worse than the regime itself. The reason that, for instance, we've given lots of questionable regimes, democratic and undemocratic, weapons as countries, is because we believe we still have a right to self-defense, that stability still has a purpose, that even if we aren't happy with the governments that are selling themselves to the people, there are benefits of stability from communicating what that government is doing, from communicating the progress that government is making. That is still fundamentally valuable. We don't necessarily think that's problematic. So, why do we think that in this debate that they didn't quite respond to our examples of the benefits of this? Because the glib response we heard from Steph was, well, in Zimbabwe, all that means is more bread. Which ignores the fact that in many other undemocratic regimes, they're doing far more than providing someone bread. They're ensuring that economy continues into the future and that social policy is functional. Certainly, the reason the regime is doing that is not maybe it isn't necessarily for these people's welfare. We don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. They then wanted to separate FDI and foreign aid from the question of managing these companies. But Jen said herself in the PM speech that one of the things these PR consultants do is make it easier for these regimes to get foreign aid, to get FDI. Insofar as that's true, we think that's beneficial for these states in keeping people alive during this period, because that's also a necessary condition for them to be able to challenge that regime. That's something they've been interested in. What they then wanted to talk about in this debate is that the fact that, well, you know, we think it would be much better for a transition to Morgan Tsvangirai. But if Morgan Tsvangirai can't himself solidify the control of that state, why are you, as an individual who, unlike Morgan Tsvangirai, has very little information about his own capacity to secure the political regime, makes that call for him, it puts him in power, and then leave that state to instability? Their response here is it has never been true in history that dictatorships have been replaced by dictatorships. Even if I suspended that obviously incorrect historical fact of the many many regimes throughout Africa and Southeast Asia that have replaced one despot with another tyrant, we think even just replacing the regime, by sabotaging it, you can lead to insurrection within that population and more violence. Starving people may not bring down the regime, it may make people starve and it may make people violent. We also don't think that deals with the hardest cases. Places like North Korea, sabotage that regime, who replaces them? We think it might be a vacuum. We don't necessarily think that's politically good for those individuals at that particular time. We don't believe that it's incumbent upon an individual to make your assumptions about what's best for those people at that particular point in time. Yes?
So that goes to lots of reasons why we have massive civil society institutions which can come in and help guide these kinds of power vacuums towards democratic transitions. Can you engage with that, please?
Well, maybe these individuals should go and work for those civil society organisations under your premise, but we don't necessarily believe that these organisations, that they can be aware those organisations are going to come in and are going to effectively help these groups, because we don't necessarily think that in the collapse of regime that by your own logic has had complete control of the political, social and economic apparatus of these people, that just a bunch of consultants, well-meaning people with degrees in development studies are going to be the ones to ensure that democracy is engendered in these states. We think in fact what happens is coups are replaced by coups, and we think and popular movements that don't articulate their goals and therefore are taken over by military or other sources in that form of government. We think that's incredibly damaging. Why do we believe that the best kind of transition is one that comes from the people itself? Because even if it is true that these people have got the best fucking consultants ever, we still believe that the dissatisfaction of living in a despotic regime is available to the individuals within that regime, to the citizens that live there. And we believe it's their obligation to defend their own self-interest. And that obligation resides with them for a very important reason, because they are the ones with the most information about how best to create change within that particular society, about the right moment to create change. And we think that that's incredibly important, because we've seen recently in changes in the Arab Spring that when these popular movements had that capacity to rise up, that meant that their changes were more likely to be long-lasting, rather than elite groups sabotaging them. Finally, we believe that it's not necessarily just the case that, as Steph said, that you're not going to lead to them shutting themselves away. We believe that, for instance, even if these people are just providing PR and connections with the states in the external world, it's good that Western liberal people are providing that, rather than people from other dictatorships. It's good they're providing the connections with other countries, because that's the best way to moderate them. We don't necessarily believe that just because dictatorships are bad, that it's your obligation to tear them down. We believe that that can lead to worse consequences. But first of all, we don't believe you should expose yourself to that personal risk. We're very, very proud to oppose.
Thank that speaker very much for his comments. Now we move into the second half, and I'm going to ask Jay and the member of government to open the case for Victoria Wood.
A personal hero of the closing government is an economist by the name of Milton Friedman. He's much maligned for doing this, going to Augustin Pinochet and telling him, look, you should implement this economic policy because I think it's going to be great for the economy of Chile. Pinochet took that advice, and we think that Friedman was pilloried for that. But actually what happened, and what's our contention last out of the House, is Friedman's belief was, in the long term, economic freedom is linked with political freedom. What he was able to do was pull the wool over that dictator's eyes by giving him advice that was contrary to his direct interest, but in the interest of the people who lived in Chile. And we think that Western consultants of the sort we're considering this debate are the ones who are able to, in a way, dictate to their dictators by virtue of their place. That's the first extension of what we're going to bring you. Why it's morally appropriate, given that power they have over the dictators, for them to pervade this kind of play this role as saboteurs. But secondly, we say that as Western citizens, people like Milton Friedman, people like IBM, ought to act in ways consistent with the foundational principles of the nation from which they come, and the principles by which their lives are substantially better and substantially freer. They are acting immorally, if they purvey advice which improves the efficiency of dictatorships and denigrates the rights of other individuals overseas. Those are going to be the two planks of my contention. Firstly, though, 2 points in rebuttal. First is about the obligations of these individuals. And we absolutely agree with the contention of the open opposition that individuals have no duty at all to maximize the amount of utility in the world, right? They don't have to be utility-producing monsters. That's not the contention of our side of the House. This is the contention, and talking about the government clearly. At the point where they're doing harm, which violates the individual rights of others, we ought to be able to restrict them from committing those harms. In the same way that in the West even, if you do things which are better for your family, but if they are criminal, you put a restriction on your rights to do that, right? That's the first response, and we think that in fact you're actually creating harm, and the point where you're creating harm is very different from having to maximise benefits. That's what we're talking about in this debate. But in addition, we think that we're not actually placing any significant restriction on the ability of these people to make money for their own betterment anyway, right? Because they don't have to engage with a Western not a non-Western dictator. They can make money in a vast variety of other ways. We're not actually placing any significant restriction on them. We're saying at the point which you engage with a dictator who denigrates rights, you ought not to act in ways which are counterproductive to individual rights. And we'll get to that in our second point. But then, the second point of rebuttal I want to make are in response to the ideas I had about the kinds of policy advice proffered by these consultants and how they think that it's actually going to be better for the people in the long term. Here's the first thing they said. Well, economic policy is just about the efficiency of the economy, and that helps people no matter what, because you're all part of the economy, right? But actually what you're doing is not like helping the general economic interest, but the economic interest of the person you are contracted to help. That's the dictator, right? If Mugabe hires you to be like, he doesn't go improve the general economy of Zimbabwe. He goes, how can I run my military economy more efficiently, right? At the expense of the rest of the people of the country. Again, the idea that like political advice might not be the best because you like Shangarai might actually be slightly worse than Mugabe. Like ignores the fact that Mugabe hired you for a specific purpose, which is to oppress Shangarai more efficiently, and that's what you're contracted for. And you specifically perform that by helping them murder them quicker, or helping them like shipping them away faster, or like restricting their rights like even worse. Particularly they talked about the idea that like well it's good for them because you can burnish their image just so they get FDI and direct aid, but they don't necessarily benevolently like distribute that aid to the country, right? You help them get aid, which helps them prop up their regime, right? The general theme emerging from all these points is this. I'll take you in a second. Like, they're saying that when you enact a dictator's policy, you do good for the country, but the person they trust in to decide what is good for the country is the dictator who is issuing the KPIs which these consultants have to meet. And that's why the kinds of policies they're likely to enact are going to be net harmful to people in that country, rather than net beneficial, as open opposition claims. Before I move on, opening.
If it is true that we all have this obligation to remove harm, why is it the case that we don't have an obligation to take up arms as citizens against this?
No. You don't have an obligation to remove harm, right? You don't have to find all the harm in the world and like vacuum it up. You have an obligation not to create more harm, and that's what you're doing by helping dictators be more efficient dictators. That was the basic conclusion of what I just said. So I want to move on now. Firstly then, why is it the fact that Western consultants are uniquely well placed to dictate to dictators? And essentially answering the claim we heard in a POI, but also from the opening about how they're going to basically turn away all the rest of the consultants in the long term. Basically we say it's because they're at a massive informational advantage over the dictators. Firstly, by hypothesis, the reason these people are getting external dictators is because they have no expertise in that area within the country, right? That person doesn't know how to enact good economic policy, or they don't know how to burnish their own PR image. They're getting someone external precisely because they don't know how to do that thing better themselves. But what advantage does that give to the consultant? They can tell them basically whatever they want about their area of expertise, and that dictator has no way of checking that advice. So you can't go like, oh, so Milton Friedman, you should, like you say, you should like implement these free market regimes and implement monetarist regime. Well, I've been reading a lot of Keynes recently, and he like disagrees with that, right? You can't say that because you're not an economic expert. You have an informational and knowledge advantage over the dictator as a consultant. But secondly, you can't be held responsible when things go bad because the impacts of what you say are so diffuse. There's no way you're going to individually as a consultant be attributed the responsibility by the dictator. What does that mean? It's hard for you to be fired, right? Because they can't hold you responsible. What does that mean for that individual consultant morally? Because that allows them to give advice and sabotage, which are in the interest of the entire country and the people in general, and the economy in general, and the political sphere in general, which aren't in the interest of the dictator specifically. And at that point we think they're going to be very effective saboteurs. And what does that mean morally? They can act as guided missiles to the heart of the regime in a way that things like governments can't, and things like NGOs can't, because they're politically motivated and politically constrained in the way their advice is interpreted. That's the first really powerful moral reason why consultants and consultants alone can be one of the most effective missiles we can send to bring down that regime. That's the first plank of our extension. Secondly then, why is it that as Western citizens, these consultants ought not to act in ways which are contrary to the foundational principles of the nation in which they were raised, and the nation which has so benefited them? We think that in Iraq, in the 1990s, when we found out that there were consultants, or basically Western companies, that were abusing the food for oil program by giving kickbacks to the Saddam regime, they were prosecuted as treasonous. Why is that? Why is that justified? Because what they were doing was essentially giving money to the Saddam Hussein regime as opposed to the food, which was in the Western interest as purveyors of individual rights for Iraqi citizens. And they were held treasonous because what they were doing was undermining and actually contrary to the very foundational principle of the countries which they are citizens of. And what is that principle? That is the idea that as an individual, as a human, you have some foundational, non-negotiable rights. And as a citizen of a country which respects that principle, you act in ways contrary to that. Just like you should be prosecuted within your own country, we think, and you can't be prosecuted for this like mutually beneficial contractual act with other countries, or to, as an individual, if you are acting morally, not act in ways which are contrary to that foundational individual right. That's why we say the individual Western consultants and Western citizens ought to respect the very right which made it able that they were able to succeed. So even if we can't prosecute them for giving this kind of advice to dictators, which makes them act more efficiently, they ought individually take the moral decision not to act in a way to denigrate democracy and denigrate the rights of those individuals that the dictators dictate against, the dictators oppress. Fundamentally, these individuals ought to make a moral calculus, which is to undermine dictators in the best way they can. They're uniquely well placed to do that, and the strong moral impetus which forces them to, and that's why we are proud to propose.
So let's thank you very much for his comments. Now we cross and as the member of the opposition can to open up the case for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, side proposition lives in this lovely world where once a dictator goes, a beautiful Western liberal democracy emerges. Everyone has rights, everyone has food, you have economic growth, and everything is perfect. Unfortunately for them, that's not how democratic transition works. It's not how it works when you sabotage a leader, and it's not how it works when you instill paranoia in the elites and paranoia in the people against the West that you need them to cooperate with. What we saw in this debate so far was that our opening half came up and told us why this might or may not be a good outcome. What I'm going to tell you in my extension is a few things. First of all, why the vast majority of these situations, this will be bad, why it will be bad, and how it will get that way, and the comparative of what will actually happen after the sabotage. I'll do so in 2 points. First of all, the actual process of sabotage, focusing on the type of consultancy that these people actually do and how that can really hurt people in the process of sabotage. And secondly, what this will actually lead to as an end game, which isn't a beautiful Western liberal democracy as side proposition would have you believe. But first, 6 points of rebuttal, right? Okay, so the first thing they told us on opening government that's still standing is that, like, listen guys, you may enable dictators to align with Western aid needs, and then those Western countries might give you aid. 1, plausibly this is good, right? Plausibly aid can get some of it to the people. Plausibly aid can actually get you some food in that country. Plausibly telling dictators how to align yourself with these things might mean that 10 less people starve each day. Potentially this might be a good thing. You haven't shown definitively why it's a bad thing, right? We think it could potentially be good. Secondly, they said, listen guys, we didn't really know that Gaddafi was bad, we didn't know that his son was bad, because they were able to just come and charm us. 1, we all knew Gaddafi was bad. There are a lot of international human rights agencies that told us he was bad. We all knew that he was bad, and we also had trade restrictions on him because he was bad as a demonstration of that we knew that he was bad. Then they said, listen guys, you're harming other people, and therefore you should stop. Plausibly what this means is that this debate isn't about if you harm other people, but which side of this motion actually harms more people. We're going to show you in the extension why it's their side, not ours. Then they said, listen guys, when you do this consultancy, you only help the dictator. This is simply false. One of the things that really helps dictators is when people in their country are happy. This is generally why they hire a lot of consultants, right? In the oil monarchies is the best example of this, which have a ruling bargain with their people and have one of the best welfare states in the entire world as a result of Western consultants. It's just false to fundamentally assume that anytime you help a dictator, it will obviously not be in the interest of the rest of society, right? Then they said, listen guys, they're just not going to find out if we're sabotaging them. 1, plausibly they'll find out if you're giving them bad policy advice. They may check it with another person. They may see systematic failure of your economic policy. Secondly, even if this isn't the case that this specific dictator finds out, the next regime will highly suspect it that the things that you were consulting on led to the downfall of that dictator. That means the next regime is going to expel all of these Western consultants and perpetuate the myth the West is out to get us, the West is out to make us fall, and become a paranoid regime that clamps down on everyone. Then they said, listen guys, we need to bring Western rights to the rest of the world because it's our obligation. 1, why do we have an obligation to impose our way of life on everyone else in the world? They didn't substantiate that. But 2, what we would say is that you need to balance this moral obligation, if it does exist, with the practical effects that you might have by trying to introduce these rights. let's look into the process of sabotage, right? Because what I'm going to tell you is when consulting can actually be helpful, and usually is helpful, and when specifically the process of sabotage is fundamentally damaging and should not be pursued. One, what we would say is that there are 3 types of consulting that generally occurs in these countries, right? And that when you screw them up, this will really hurt people because of the way that you can actually sabotage these things. One, let's look at civil consulting, right? This generally looks with like social and economic things, right? So you tell them, they bring you in, and they ask, well, listen, guys, a lot of people are like uprising. We think that this is potentially bad. How do we get through to them? A lot of the time, what they try to do is give you an economic base and an economic reason not to want to uprise. Why do people do this and bring them in, right? Why do dictators not just use the military? Because it's not necessarily sustainable to use the military. A lot of the time, you get a lot of international criticism when you use the military to clamp down on people. And moreover, it's just sometimes in the interest of these people to have a peaceful society where they try to have a ruling bargain with you and opt into your system of regime simply because they are well taken care of in those situations. This is exactly why the oil monarchies bring in Western consultants on economic issues to try to do this. It's exactly why whenever there's an uprising inside of Kuwait, inside of Saudi Arabia, most people's public service salaries go up by 5 to 10%, right? Western consultants try to raise the living standards simply because they have different conceptions and starting points of what they believe to be acceptable, but moreover because it's fundamentally in the interest of that dictator to be able to actually keep their people happy. Why does this get bad? This means that sabotaging necessarily means that you fundamentally like torpedo and erode the economic and social policies in the society. That's probably bad. Let's look at military, right? Because they said, listen guys, sometimes we tell them to do bad things like oppress people. One, they'll probably still oppress them if we're not actually telling them how to do this, right? But two, what we would say is that a lot of the time these consultants tell them how to properly align with international law as best as possible. Although this generally can give them a scapegoat in certain situations, what it actually does on the ground means that they are less harsh inside of these situations because they are fundamentally afraid, Eric Prince is fundamentally afraid of getting pursued by the International Criminal Court. It means that they actually start to align with much better systems of these regulations and much less harsh things on the ground. Finally, political, right? Because sometimes they do give you PR ways of making people happy inside of your society. Why is this sometimes helpful? Because sometimes civil unrest and civil war is bad, right? Sometimes it doesn't lead to a clear successor, and sometimes when people are unhappy with a leader, all it does is lead two sides pitted against each other into an endless bloody war where no one wins. We think sabotaging this can lead to those situations which aren't helpful to the situation. What will this actually lead to, right? Because what they said is they assumed, no thank you, is that dictators kind of go away and everything will be good. What happens if these regimes fall, which is the first scenario, right? So the first thing is that you have is a massive power vacuum will actually emerge, generally with no successor, right? Because this usually isn't in the face of democratic movements, but just a sabotage of regime. I'll take a point now, go.
Civil consulting at best enables this regime to buy a critical mass of the elite to keep the regimes in power. They don't do white collar goods.
I'm going to tell you why this is good. I'm going to tell you why this is good, right? Sometimes dictatorships are better than democracy. Why? Once people go away, once a dictator goes away, especially when sabotage is suspected as this, you don't get a good regime afterwards. Why? There's no clear successor and people are generally impoverished now because you ruined all their economic policy, right? So generally they just want stability. Usually in these countries they turn to the military to do this. Why is the military bad? One, they're generally really prone to having military crackdowns instead of economic policies, right? That's probably worse off for them. Secondly, they're generally a paranoid institution, especially when you pointed out to them that the West is trying to sabotage them. This means they're going to become more isolated from the West, we can have no influence on them, and they're generally going to now have the veil of legitimacy to crack down on scapegoats, minorities, and other people in their country that they say are taking away their capacity to actually have a stable environment. We think that's bad. Finally, if they don't fall and you're actually found out of doing this, one, you may be killed. You probably don't have a moral obligation to do something where you're going to be killed if it's an unfulfillable moral obligation, and you're probably never going to do any good after that. Second, if they suspect the West is trying to sabotage them, the NGOs will be expelled too. It's not just consultants that get kicked out, it's all the NGOs that you're relying on to give you a good government afterwards. You remove the entirety of Western presence, you remove the entirety of the good things consulting can do, and in the process what you do is erode the standard of living, you lead into a bloody situation with a military crackdown and a paranoid government. We are proud to oppose this motion.
Thank you very much for the comments. Now we cross back and ask Stephen to close out the case for Vic Wellington and the Gov bench.
At the conclusion of this debate, there are two questions that we need to ask. The first is, in principle, to whom do consultants really owe a duty? Is it to the person that they enter a contract with, or is it to the citizens of that particular nation? And the second question relates to the practical consequences of essentially saying that consultants should sabotage the nature of the advice that they give. Is it to undermine the authority and power of that particular regime, or is it to lead to them to not be employed or be kicked out, or ultimately bad outcomes to accrue? So let's start with the first question, which relates to the principal to whom consultants owe a duty. And from the outset, the government bench has been very clear. We regard people as owing moral duties to other individuals, not to engage in activity which harms them. And the response from the opposition bench has been particularly confused, because they have stated correctly that an individual doesn't owe an obligation to essentially maximise the utility of others, and we agree. But the case in respect of the moral case in this debate relates to the fact that you shouldn't engage in behaviour which undermines the rights of other people. And that's, for example, why we don't allow people to commit crimes domestically. And given that you don't allow people to engage in behaviour that encourage other people to commit crimes, why, when there's a border between you, can consultants currently legitimately say, well, I'm just here to help this dictator, and sure, he's figuring out the fastest way to murder this group of people, never mind, because they happen to be based in another country. And that's the moral objection that the opposition bench has never been able to answer. Because when you ask them in a direct point of information whether they regarded the consultancy services of IBM in respect of punch card systems used essentially by the Hitler regime to administer ultimately the Holocaust, but in the lead up, the control of Jewish populations into ghettos, they said, yes, that is immoral. At the point that they concede that it's immoral, you have a duty to restrict and stop doing that type of thing. But in addition, we brought you additional material from Closing Government, which relate to the fact that this is the ordinary exercise of duties. States do not allow you to engage in activity that essentially undermines democracy or undermines human rights. You can't sell weapons to Ahmadinejad if you're an American corporate citizen, because you are a product of the West. You are a citizen of democracy, and it's that capacity which essentially prohibits you from engaging in dictators with the way that you guys regarded as completely normal. But then in response to these moral arguments, you said, well, look, the moral case is never made out if there are actually going to be worse outcomes. And the examples that they gave of worse outcomes was the failure to give advice that would improve the operation of an economy, for example, keeping countries in poverty. Let's consider that, because essentially they've confused the operation of dictators. They think dictators go, what's in the best interests of my people, and therefore I'll do that. But the reason why democratic governments essentially operate in that way is because their support base is based off a majority of the people, and that's why they consider the general welfare of ordinary citizens. How do dictators consider which policies to implement? They look at their support base, which is typically comprised of people from the military, and then they figure out the most effective way to provide for those particular individuals. And that's why the calculus undertaken by democratic and dictatorial governments is separate, and why you can't impute a good intention to the dictator in respect of economic growth. Yes, I'll take closing.
Okay, this is entirely non-comparative with what we brought to you on Closing Opposition, where we told you that human rights are in a worse state under your system in the transition and afterward.
Yeah, but we disagree with that, right? The very point is that at the point that you're able to sabotage, one of the most effective ways to sabotage a government is precisely by advocating for the kind of policy that creates an alternative power base within the country. It's to say, you want to increase economic growth? Here we're going to increase economic growth for the general welfare of the people, because that's the thing most likely to undermine you, rather than figuring out the best way that you can, like, through inflation, build up a successful military in Zimbabwe, for example. So the reality is that dictators and the calculus that you guys regarded them as undertaking, using consultants to improve the general welfare, is totally contrary to their interests. Because at the point that they improve the general welfare, rather than direct benefits to the people who maintain them in power, you are essentially ensuring that they stay in power. That's why they use consultants, not to undermine their authority. Okay, so let's move on to the second issue then, which is essentially, like, will Western consultants still be trusted? Why will people still use them? And what is the nature of the advice that they give? What we heard from Closing Opposition is, well, at the point that you realise that they're sabotaging you, you don't actually, you won't actually seek out their advice in the first place. This completely ignored one half of the extension brought by Closing Government in this debate, which was precisely why dictators are in a very bad position to consider whether consultants are acting in their interests. No thanks. The first reason that we gave you as to why that is that dictators tend to operate at an informational disadvantage, right? The fact that Pinochet was an excellent military commander didn't make him, like a leading light in the ongoing debate between monetarists and Keynesians, right? That was the example that we gave. So the reality is when he says this doesn't seem to be working out precisely the way that you anticipated, he's actually very bad at judging whether that's the case because he doesn't actually know the way alternative policies would operate. And that was the second point that we brought you. That when you're talking about the nature of advice that consultants give to countries generally, the effects of most of those policies are diffuse. Look, the reality is the reason why companies get consultants is mainly a risk management thing, so they can go, this smart guy told me to do it. Not because it's easy to assess the quality of the advice that you get. The same thing affects governments, and so the reality is that actually it's going to be so difficult for them to assess that they're not going to regard them as having been sabotaged or undermined in any particular way. But moreover, then we heard from closing opposition, essentially, that, well, you're never going to get any better outcome because you're just going to get a new dictator. But this completely missed all the analysis that we brought regarding exactly what happens in the transition phase. Because at the point that the nature of the advice that you're giving is in the general interest, rather than the specific interest of the particular dictator, we think that's massively advantageous for the people in that country in respect of any particular transition. Why? Because that transition is more likely to happen rather than at the death of a particular dictator, but in response to alternative political movements. So we think actually that's less likely to happen on this side of the house than it is on your side of the house, where essentially you allow consultants to advise dictators how best to stay in power. But moreover, presumably you guys want some kind of transition. You've never demonstrated why that transition is likely to happen in a really good way. It's not as if they wake up one morning and go, you know what, rather than asking these consultants how I can best maintain my power, I'm going to ask them about the best way to move towards a democratic election. Because you've never demonstrated essentially that there's an alternative route for dictators, the best path is to essentially stop Western consultants propping them up in the expression of their political power over their population. At the end of this debate, we've had an opposition bench which has never understood the moral arguments and has made spurious practical arguments against what we proposed. For those reasons, we propose.
And thank you very much for his comments, and then we call on Guy to provide the whip speech for Durham, the opposition bench, and the debate as a whole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the end of this debate, the one question the government bench has never answered is would the lives of the citizens of the oil monarchies or numerous other dictatorships really be better if two situations occurred? One, if the kind of economic consultants who prop up their economy, who fund the welfare state, and who provide expertise as well as limitations to the gross abuses in these dictatorships left. And two, would it really be desirable at the point where these countries fell, and specifically when they fell by the means of sabotage? That's what Pam brought you in the extension, and that's what was completely ignored by the previous speaker. I want to bring three things today. Firstly, I want to talk briefly about the rights analysis and what our view of democracy is on the opposition bench. Secondly, I want to look at Pam's extension as to what consultants do and why in this case we think it's beneficial that they stay in these countries, especially given the fact that opening government conceded that it was likely the net effect that none of them would ever be hired. Third, I want to look at the effect of sabotage and the long-time collapsing of regimes. First, one quick point of rebuttal right at the start. They say that we never respond to the idea, no thank you, that these people are uniquely placed not to have their sabotage noticed. I think it's curious that they ignore Pam's three responses to this. Firstly, the fact that you are likely to notice if there are serial failures in your public policy, your military, or other things. Secondly, the fact that you can empirically cross-reference the suggested policies and whether or not they have the desired outcome. And third, if they assume that they are likely to topple the regime through this advice, I think it's plausible the regime might notice that the policies they're advocating haven't been too good, right? The point is they may not have a specific knowledge of the way a sovereign wealth fund acts, for example, but at the point where they see it's being undermined, or the point where they see their military is being undermined, we think it's plausible they're going to notice this is bad advice. Let's move on to the rights analysis. Because right from the start we get from opening the idea that we have a shared duty due to our common humanity. Opening up tell you there are your own concerns that might override this. What Pam raises in a point of information more specifically is that there are other concerns that we have to deal with. Namely the fact that we like democracy in general, but we like it due to the fact that it provides instrumental goods to the population, right? Two things are key as regards their case. Firstly, they assume efficacy in achieving democracy and not endangering other people's standards of life. but secondly, they ignore the trade-off that occurs under their model with regards to other rights, right? So we believe, even if we believe, no thank you, that there is a duty to humanity, right? What we believe is that their model worsens the standard of living of everyone in that country, and as a result voids that duty to humanity. Now their response to this was the spurious example of the Nazis, right? There's one main reason as to why this would be different. The trade-off under our model is things like security, stability, and living standards versus democracy. Under their model, it is some corporate profits versus genocide. I find it plausible that genocide is a morally different thing. I've propped it, I know it's non-defensible, right? Their response to this was, well, you are uniquely placed to do this, therefore you have a duty. Firstly, we don't see the fact that you are able to do something as necessarily establishing a moral duty. They never proved that. Secondly, what Pam tells you very specifically is that same positioning allows you to benefit the population of that community or that country in the largest way, and more specifically, the specific types of consulting that occurs allows you to do it. Thus, even to the extent where we accept that duty, no thank you, what happens is you better fulfill that duty by not sabotaging their regime. Lastly, they ask us, well, how do you ever achieve that transition? First, I don't think it's our burden to prove a completely formal transition model that will work in every case. What I think it's our burden to prove is that the status quo and not pursuing a moral duty, no thank you, of not consulting these things, is better in real terms. So let's move on to that, the extension that was completely ignored about what consultants do. Opening government tell us, no thank you, that to some extent they're enabling, right? Opening opposition tell us that you're not necessarily achieving better outcomes. What Pam tells you very explicitly is the comparative makes the people in these states much worse off, and as a result we don't fulfill our larger duty to their humanity. How? Three forms of consulting. First, in terms of civil consulting and so on, Opening Gov tell us, well, this makes it easier for people to achieve, no thank you, they're like burnishing their image and as a result achieving foreign aid. What Pam tells you quite well is maybe it's good for fulfilling our duties to other people's humanity if foreign aid is delivered and if they don't die from starvation. But moreover, what she tells you is there are many circumstances, and indeed nearly all circumstances, where the incentives of a dictator to have consulting which benefits the economy aligns with the incentives of the population. Why is that the case? What she tells you very clearly is that there's a ruling bargain in many of these places. That is to say, at the point where living standards decrease substantially, you are more likely to get civil unrest, which threatens the position of the dictator in a meaningful way. That's why there's an incentive to pursue consulting that has economic growth that genuinely benefits everybody. Their response is, well, you need to persuade critical mass. Firstly, not necessarily true. You still need to have the majority of the population being benefited. But two, non-comparative. At least under our model, we are having that economic stuff which helps lots of people. I'll take opening.
Right, but what we tell you is that bargain is with a select few people, which is why, for instance, no
one
one
is part of
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, well, actually, the majority of the Saudi population are benefited from the ruling bargain, and specifically from things like sovereign wealth funds and resource extraction, which necessitates Western consultants for much of the business. That would likely collapse and would probably result in a net worse outcome. Secondly, Pam tells you about the political. She says, well, it's generally good that you can burnish that image because it causes a level of a thaw, and moreover, it allows you to gain things like foreign direct investment. Their example is they say, well, Libya allowed itself to be caricatured as a perfect democracy. First, nobody was ever fooled. Even during the years of the thaw, kind of 97 onwards, you still had the perception of Libya as a bad state in general. But secondly, right, what happens more explicitly is that at least we had a thaw that was caused by that consulting, which allowed us to broadly help shift certain things. Lastly, they say, well, the military, and dealing with the military, they say, well, we prevent like war crimes and so on. Firstly, we think that's an extremely narrow burden. They need to deal much more broadly with war crimes. What Pam tells you is the placement of Western consultants existing there allows a limiting factor that doesn't otherwise exist. Why? Because they have more respect for certain international norms and do not want to be held up in front of international tribunals, etc. Lastly, what Pam tells you very explicitly is what sabotage does. If it is the case that this regime falls, the likely methods of sabotage cause a military regime that more precisely is paranoid of any form of consulting or help of the population because of the fact it's been utilised to bring down regimes in the past. That net effect is a group that is more paranoid and that helps its population less, voiding the basic duty that government wants to humanity. If you do not, or even if you do topple the regime, you give a great impetus to the idea that we are being sabotaged, giving a vast incentive to crack down, to expel NGOs, and to hurt your population much, much more. We say that you serve any moral duty that you do have much better when you stay and do not sabotage, and we're proud to oppose.
Thank you all. If I could